The earliest known pharaohs rose to power around 3100 BCE, unifying Upper and Lower Egypt. For nearly 3 millennia, until the Roman conquest in 30 BCE, these rulers held absolute authority. Throughout this vast stretch of history, one pattern stands out. The pharaoh's role wasn't just that of a king. They were seen as a god on earth, a living deity, a figure whose every action was tied to the well-being of the cosmos itself. This elevated status, while central to Egyptian belief, also created a perfect environment for traits we might now call narcissistic to flourish and define an entire civilization's leadership. These rulers, from the great pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom around 2600 BCE to the powerful warrior kings of the New Kingdom, especially between 1550 BCE and 1070 BCE, consistently displayed an intense focus on self-glorification, an insatiable need for admiration, and an unwavering belief in their own supreme importance. They built colossal monuments not just for their gods, but as eternal testaments to their own power. They crafted elaborate narratives of their divine birth and unparalleled victories. Their names and images were etched into stone across the land, designed to last forever, dominating the landscape and the minds of their people. This wasn't merely ambition. It was a deeply ingrained system of self-exaltation that shaped every aspect of their rule and left an indelible mark on history. The very foundation of pharaonic rule rested on a belief system that placed the king at the very center of the universe. This wasn't just a political position, it was a religious one. The pharaoh was considered the son of Ra, the sun god, or Horus, the sky god. This divine connection meant that their will was considered divine law. Imagine being told from birth that you are not just a leader, but a living god. This belief system, passed down through generations of rulers, would naturally foster an extraordinary sense of self-importance. Every success, every good harvest, every military victory was attributed to the pharaoh's divine favor and actions. Conversely, any misfortune could be blamed on a lack of proper devotion to the pharaoh, further cementing their essential role in the cosmic order. This constant reinforcement of their supreme importance, both from priests and the general populace, would inevitably inflate a ruler's ego to unimaginable levels. They were not merely governing, they were maintaining the balance of the universe, known as Mat, through their divine presence. This extraordinary burden and privilege created a worldview where their personal desires and their kingdom's prosperity became one and the same. There was no distinction between what was good for the pharaoh and what was good for Egypt. Their personal glory was Egypt's glory. Their immortality was Egypt's immortality. This absolute intertwining of personal identity with national destiny is a hallmark of the pharaoh's unique brand of leadership, one that we will explore in detail throughout this series. The sheer scale of their self-representation, from the pyramids to the monumental statues, speaks volumes about this ingrained sense of superiority and the desire to project an image of unassailable power and eternal greatness. They truly believed they were different, separate, and vastly superior to ordinary mortals. A belief tirelessly promoted and upheld by the entire state apparatus for thousands of years. This fundamental setup, where the ruler was literally seen as a divine being, laid the groundwork for many behaviors that modern psychology would easily identify as profoundly narcissistic. Their world was built around them, for them, and because of them. Pharaohs were not shy about showing their greatness. In fact, it was a central part of their rule. They built huge structures, not just for the gods, but often more so for themselves. These buildings were meant to be seen from far away to impress everyone with the pharaoh's power and wealth. Think about the pyramids, for example. These weren't just tombs. They were massive statements of the pharaoh's eternal life and his connection to the heavens. Each pyramid was a king's personal mountain, a way to reach the gods and become one with them. The scale of these projects is truly mind-boggling, even by today's standards. To gather the materials, organize the thousands of workers, and complete these structures required an immense amount of resources and control. It spoke volumes about the pharaoh's ability to command and to achieve what seemed impossible. But it wasn't just about pyramids. Later, pharaohs built sprawling temple complexes, many of which were almost as much about the pharaoh as they were about the deities. Take the mortuary temples of the New Kingdom. These were temples dedicated to the pharaoh's cult after his death, ensuring his continued worship and importance. They were filled with statues of the pharaoh, larger than life, often showing him in heroic poses, battling enemies, or offering gifts to the gods. The walls of these temples were covered in detailed carvings and paintings that told stories of the pharaoh's great deeds, his military victories, his wise rule, and his close relationship with the gods. These narratives were carefully controlled propaganda, designed to enhance his image and cement his place in history. Every corner, every column, every painted scene reinforced the idea of the pharaoh as an indispensable, powerful, and divinely favored ruler. This was not humble devotion. It was bold self-promotion on an epic scale. The sheer size of these structures was meant to overwhelm and inspire awe. Walking through a temple like Karnak or Luxor, one can't help but feel small in comparison to the towering statues and colossal columns. This feeling was intentional. It was meant to make the ordinary person feel the overwhelming power and divine presence of the pharaoh. The building projects also served a practical purpose in keeping the population busy and unified, but their primary message was always one of royal grandeur and immortality. Every block of stone laid, every hieroglyph carved, was a permanent reminder of who was in charge and who held ultimate power. The pharaohs invested an enormous amount of the kingdom's wealth and manpower into these projects. This wasn't just about building functional places of worship or burial. It was about shaping the very landscape of Egypt to reflect the pharaoh's personal greatness. They literally carved their legacy into the stone of the land, making it impossible for future generations to forget their name or their perceived achievements. This desire for lasting fame, for an eternal echo of their own importance, is a classic sign of a strong narcissistic drive. Their building programs were not simply acts of piety. They were acts of supreme self-definition and self-glorification, ensuring that their image and name would endure for all time. Pharaohs were masters of storytelling, but these weren't just bedtime tales. They created official stories about themselves, about their battles, and about how they ruled. These stories were spread everywhere, from the walls of temples to small everyday objects. The goal was always the same: to make the pharaoh look incredibly powerful, wise, and loved by the gods. They were, in essence, the ancient world's first spin doctors, carefully crafting a public image that left no room for doubt about their supreme authority. Every inscription, every piece of art, every public declaration was part of this grand narrative. For example, battle scenes carved on temple walls almost always showed the pharaoh as a fearless warrior. Single-handedly defeating thousands of enemies, he would be depicted larger than life, towering over his foes, his chariot crushing his enemies, while his own soldiers were often shown in smaller scale. Simply supporting his magnificent actions, the reality of ancient warfare was of course far more complex and often less glorious. Battles involved thousands of soldiers, strategic planning, and often messy outcomes. But the pharaonic narrative ignored these details. It focused solely on the pharaoh's personal bravery and divine protection, making him the absolute hero of every story. Defeats were rarely, if ever, recorded. If a military campaign didn't go well, the official story might simply omit it, or it might be spun as a minor setback quickly overcome by the pharaoh's brilliance. The goal was to maintain an unbroken image of success and invincibility. This control over information extended beyond military matters. Scenes of the pharaoh making offerings to the gods would show him as the only intermediary between humanity and the divine, reinforcing his unique status. He would be shown feeding the hungry, bringing justice, and ensuring the prosperity of Egypt, even if these were collective efforts or simply the result of good harvests. The message was always clear: the pharaoh was the source of all good things in Egypt. This constant reinforcement of their supreme importance created a reality where the pharaoh was almost beyond questioning. To doubt the pharaoh was not just an act of disloyalty, it was an act against the gods, against Mat, the cosmic order itself. This made it very difficult for anyone to challenge their authority or their narrative. The scribes, artists, and priests who worked for the pharaoh understood their role in upholding this grand illusion. Their careers, and often their lives, depended on faithfully presenting the pharaoh in the most favorable light possible. They were part of a vast system designed to amplify the pharaoh's ego and project an image of perfection. This careful construction of a royal narrative, designed to control public perception and ensure unwavering admiration, is a classic narcissistic strategy. It's about maintaining a flawless external image, regardless of the internal reality, and demanding constant validation for that image. For the pharaohs, this wasn't just about popularity. It was about maintaining their divine right to rule and their eternal legacy. In the grand scheme of pharaonic rule, the ordinary people often seemed to matter less than the pharaoh's own glory. While official stories might show the pharaoh as a caring ruler, the reality often painted a different picture. One where the lives and well-being of the common folk were secondary to the pharaoh's grand plans and personal needs. This apparent lack of empathy, a common trait in narcissistic personalities, manifested in several ways. Think about the massive building projects we discussed earlier: the pyramids, the temples, the colossal statues. These were feats of engineering and organization that required an immense labor force. Thousands upon thousands of people, often farmers during the off-season or skilled craftsmen, were conscripted to work on these projects for years, sometimes for their entire lives. While they were typically paid in food and shelter, and many considered it an honor to work for the divine pharaoh, the sheer scale of the effort meant hardship, danger, and often short lives for many laborers. There's little evidence to suggest that pharaohs agonized over the toll these projects took on the individual workers or their families. The suffering of the many was a necessary cost for the glorification of the one. The grand vision, the eternal legacy, and the divine mandate of the pharaoh outweighed any individual hardship. Similarly, in times of war or famine, the pharaoh's primary concern was often the stability of the state and the continuation of his own power, rather than the immediate relief of his subjects' suffering. While religious texts might emphasize the pharaoh's role in maintaining Mat, which included justice and prosperity for all, the practical application often saw a focus on resource allocation for royal needs first, then for the general populace. The pharaoh was at the top of a very strict social hierarchy. Beneath him were the priests, nobles, and scribes, and at the bottom were the farmers, laborers, and slaves. The lives of those at the bottom were largely dictated by the needs of the state and the whims of the pharaoh. They were seen as tools to achieve the pharaoh's goals, whether it was to build a monument, fight a war, or harvest crops. Their individual aspirations or hardships were rarely considered in the broader context of royal ambition. Punishments for disobedience or rebellion were often swift and brutal, serving as a powerful deterrent and reinforcing the pharaoh's absolute authority. Dissent was not tolerated, because to question the pharaoh was to question the gods themselves. This rigid enforcement of power, without much apparent consideration for the individual's perspective or suffering, further highlights a detachment that can be seen as a lack of empathy. The pharaoh's world revolved around his own divine mandate and self-preservation, and the people were primarily there to support that vision. They were the resources, the workforce, the worshippers, and the audience for his eternal show of power. Their value was often measured by their utility to the royal agenda, rather than their intrinsic worth as individuals. This transactional view of his subjects, seeing them as means to an end, rather than as people with their own rights and feelings, is a strong indicator of a narcissistic leadership style that prioritizes self-aggrandizement above all else. One of the most defining characteristics of the pharaohs, and perhaps the clearest sign of their narcissistic tendencies, was their overwhelming obsession with immortality. It wasn't enough to rule in life. They wanted to rule, or at least be remembered and revered, forever. The elaborate preparations for death, which consumed a significant portion of their reign and the kingdom's resources, speak volumes about this intense focus on their own eternal glory. Every pharaoh began planning for their death almost as soon as they ascended to the throne. This wasn't a morbid preoccupation, but a practical and deeply personal project. Their tomb was not just a burial place, it was an eternal home, a gateway to the afterlife where they would continue their divine existence. And this home had to be grand, secure, and filled with everything they would need to maintain their status and comfort in the next world. From the Old Kingdom pyramids to the hidden rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings in the New Kingdom, the scale of these burial projects was immense. The construction involved architects, engineers, artists, and thousands of laborers. The interiors were painstakingly decorated with spells, prayers, and scenes depicting the pharaoh's journey through the underworld and his eventual union with the gods. These weren't just religious texts. They were personalized narratives designed to ensure the pharaoh's successful passage and eternal well-being. The practice of mummification itself was a testament to this obsession. The intricate and lengthy process of preserving the body was believed to be essential for the soul to recognize its vessel and achieve immortality. It was a complex ritual, costly and labor-intensive, performed with the utmost care, all centered on the preservation of the pharaoh's individual form. The grave goods buried with the pharaoh were equally extravagant. Gold, jewels, furniture, chariots, food, wine, and even servants in earlier periods were placed in the tomb, reflecting the pharaoh's desire to maintain his earthly status and pleasures in the afterlife. These weren't just possessions. They were symbols of his power and wealth, meant to accompany him into eternity. Even after death, the pharaoh expected continued adoration. Mortuary temples were built not just as places of burial, but as centers for the ongoing cult of the deceased pharaoh. Priests were employed to perform daily rituals, offering food and prayers to the pharaoh's spirit, ensuring his eternal nourishment and remembrance. This constant focus on their own afterlife, their legacy, and their eternal worship shows a deeply ingrained. The entire state apparatus for generations was geared towards ensuring the pharaoh's successful journey into eternity and his lasting renown. This wasn't a humble hope for salvation. It was an active, monumental effort to guarantee individual immortality and an enduring reputation. This drive to transcend death and ensure an everlasting place in history and the divine realm is arguably the ultimate manifestation of the pharaoh's narcissistic outlook. They saw themselves as indispensable, not just in life, but for all time. And they made sure that their entire civilization worked tirelessly to make that vision a reality. If there was one pharaoh who truly embodied the narcissistic traits we've been discussing, it was Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great. He ruled for an incredible 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, and during that long reign, he made sure his name and image were everywhere. Ramesses wasn't just ambitious, he was obsessed with self-promotion on a scale rarely seen before or since. He understood the power of propaganda better than almost any other ancient ruler. His goal was clear, to ensure that no one, living or dead, would ever forget Ramesses the Great. His building projects were truly colossal. He expanded temples, built new cities, and erected countless statues of himself. The Karnak temple complex, for example, saw significant additions under his rule, including the impressive hypostyle hall filled with towering columns, many bearing his cartouche. He didn't just build new structures, he also had a habit of taking over older monuments. He would often order his sculptors to carve his name over the names of previous pharaohs on existing statues and temples, effectively stealing their glory. It was a common practice in ancient Egypt, but Ramesses did it with a particular gusto, making it seem as if many great works of art and architecture were solely his creation. But perhaps the most iconic example of Ramesses' self-aggrandizement is the temple at Abu Simbel. Carved directly into a cliff face, it features 4 colossal statues of Ramesses II, each over 65 feet tall, guarding the entrance. Inside, the temple is adorned with endless depictions of his supposed military victories and his divine status. The most famous scene depicts the Battle of Kadesh, where Ramesses is shown single-handedly turning the tide of battle against the Hittites, performing superhuman feats of bravery. While the battle itself was a tactical draw, Ramesses spun it into a glorious personal victory, meticulously recorded on temple walls across Egypt. He wanted everyone to believe he was an unparalleled warrior king, even if the reality was a little more complex. Ramesses also had an enormous family, fathering dozens of children, further demonstrating his virility and importance. He even held a Sed festival, a jubilee celebration typically held after 30 years of rule, multiple times during his reign, each time renewing his strength and reaffirming his divine right to rule. Everything about Ramesses II's reign was designed to elevate him to an almost mythical status. He presented himself as a living god, a mighty warrior, and a benevolent ruler, all at once. His sheer volume of representation, the way he dominated the architectural landscape, and his tireless efforts to control his narrative make him a prime example of a pharaoh driven by an extreme form of narcissism. He was not just a king. He was a brand, a legend, crafted by himself, for himself, to endure for eternity. While Ramesses II showcased narcissism through outward grandeur, Pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, demonstrated it through a radical inward focus that reshaped Egyptian religion itself. Akhenaten wasn't content with being a living god among many gods. He wanted to elevate one god, the Aten, the sun disk, to supreme status, and in doing so, he made himself the sole intermediary between this god and humanity. This wasn't just a religious reform, it was a revolution, and at its heart was Akhenaten's own highly personal vision. Before Akhenaten, Egypt had a rich pantheon of gods, with Amun-Ra being the chief deity in the New Kingdom. Priests of Amun held immense power and wealth. Akhenaten, originally named Amenhotep IV, changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and began to suppress the worship of all other gods, particularly Amun. He closed temples, defaced images and names of other deities, and directed all worship towards the Aten. This move stripped the traditional priesthood of their power and wealth, placing all religious authority directly in Akhenaten's hands. He became the only one who could truly understand and communicate with the Aten. This made him indispensable. The single most important figure in the spiritual life of Egypt, he even built an entirely new capital city, Akhenaten, or Horizon of the Aten, now known as Amarna. This city was dedicated to the Aten and to Akhenaten himself. It was a completely new beginning, a break from all the old traditions, and it was entirely a product of Akhenaten's unique vision. The art from the Amarna period is also striking. It's very different from traditional Egyptian art. Instead of idealized, muscular forms, Akhenaten is often depicted with an elongated head, narrow shoulders, a potbelly, and wide hips. While some scholars debate if this was due to a physical condition, it's also seen as a deliberate artistic choice to emphasize his unique, non-human, androgynous connection to the Aten, making him appear distinct from ordinary mortals. He was not just a king, he was a unique, perhaps even alien, divine being. Akhenaten's reforms were deeply unpopular with the traditional priests and much of the population, who were used to worshipping many gods and feared the wrath of the neglected deities. Yet, Akhenaten pushed ahead with his vision, seemingly undeterred by dissent. His actions show an unwavering belief in his own singular understanding of divine truth, a characteristic often found in narcissistic individuals who believe their insights are superior to all others. After his death, his religious revolution was quickly undone. His city was abandoned, his name was struck from the king lists, and his monuments were torn down. The traditional gods were restored, and Akhenaten became known as the heretic king, his reign a period of chaos to be forgotten. This swift reversal highlights the intensely personal nature of his reforms, and how deeply intertwined they were with his own ego. He tried to remake an entire spiritual system around his own unique connection to a single god, effectively making himself the central figure of Egyptian religion. This uncompromising self-assertion, even in the face of widespread opposition, is a powerful example of narcissistic leadership driven by an almost messianic self-belief. Another fascinating example of pharaonic narcissism, particularly concerning the desire for singular recognition and the elimination of rivals, comes from the reign of Thutmose III. He was a mighty warrior king, often called the Napoleon of Egypt for his military conquests. But his story is also linked to a much more personal act of erasure, targeting one of the most powerful women in ancient Egyptian history. Queen Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was not just a queen, she was a pharaoh in her own right, ruling successfully for over 2 decades. From approximately 1479 to 1458 BCE initially, she served as regent for the young Thutmose III, who was her stepson and nephew. However, she eventually assumed full pharaonic titles, donned a false beard, and was depicted with the traditional male attributes of a king. Her reign was prosperous and marked by significant building projects, including her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. For many years after Hatshepsut's death, things seemed normal. But then, around 20 years into Thutmose III's sole rule, a systematic campaign began to erase her from history. Her images were chiseled off temple walls, her statues were smashed and buried, and her name was removed from official king lists. Inscriptions referring to her were plastered over or carved out. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a deliberate and widespread effort to make it seem as if she had never existed as a pharaoh. Why did Thutmose III do this? It's a complex question, but many historians believe it was driven by a need to solidify his own position and to prevent any future challenges to the traditional male line of succession. Hatshepsut, as a successful female pharaoh, represented a break from tradition. For a pharaoh like Thutmose III, who saw himself as the pinnacle of male warrior kingship, her memory might have been an uncomfortable reminder, a potential flaw in the perfect, divinely ordained order he championed. Erasing her allowed him to present an unbroken line of male rulers and to claim all the achievements of her reign for himself or for the male line. It was an act of extreme self-preservation and By removing Hatshepsut, Thutmose III wasn't just settling a political score, he was asserting his singular importance and controlling the historical narrative in a way that left no room for shared glory. His narcissistic drive demanded that he be seen as the undisputed sole ruler of his era, without any powerful female predecessor to dilute his legacy. This act of damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory, is a powerful illustration of the lengths to which pharaohs would go to protect and enhance their own image. It shows a profound insecurity alongside an overwhelming desire for control and recognition. For Thutmose III, his own greatness could only shine brightest if the light of others, even a successful predecessor, was completely extinguished. The story of Hatshepsut's erasure highlights the competitive and often ruthless nature of pharaonic power, where personal glory and an idealized self-image often trumped historical accuracy or even familial ties. For the pharaohs, being a god on earth wasn't just a title. It was a lifestyle that demanded total devotion from everyone around them. They cultivated what we might call a cult of personality, where their every move, word, and even their very presence was seen as sacred and immensely important. This cult of personality was built on a powerful mix of awe, respect, and underlying fear. From the moment people woke up in ancient Egypt, their lives were connected to the pharaoh. The land they farmed belonged to the pharaoh. The laws they followed came from the pharaoh, and the prosperity of their nation was attributed to the pharaoh's divine favor. This constant reinforcement created a deep psychological bond, where the pharaoh was seen not just as a distant ruler, but as the essential pillar of their world. Priests played a crucial role in maintaining this cult. They performed elaborate rituals in the pharaoh's name, interpreting omens and ensuring the proper worship of the gods, always with the pharaoh as the central figure. These rituals weren't just about religious belief, they were public demonstrations of the pharaoh's unique connection to the divine, solidifying his irreplaceable role in maintaining cosmic order. The royal court itself was a carefully constructed spectacle of devotion. Courtiers, officials, and nobles vied for the pharaoh's attention and favor. Their lives depended on pleasing him, anticipating his needs, and always expressing unwavering loyalty. Every gesture, every word in the pharaoh's presence was likely designed to show respect and submission. To fall out of favor with the pharaoh could mean losing everything: wealth, status, and even one's life. This constant pressure to conform and adore created an echo chamber where the pharaoh's self-perception as a divine and perfect being was constantly reinforced. No one dared to openly challenge or criticize him, because his authority was absolute and divinely sanctioned. The fear of divine punishment, often linked to the pharaoh's displeasure, was a powerful tool of control. Disloyalty was not just treason, it was sacrilege. This meant that any opposition to the pharaoh could be framed as an act against the gods and against the very fabric of Egyptian society, justifying harsh penalties. The elaborate titles, the grand ceremonies, the endless depictions of the pharaoh in heroic poses all contributed to this overwhelming cult of personality. They were designed to instill a sense of awe and to ensure that no one ever forgot the pharaoh's unique and supreme position. This environment, where personal adulation was a state-mandated requirement, created a perfect breeding ground for narcissistic traits to not only survive but to thrive. The pharaoh was constantly being told he was perfect, divine, and essential, and everyone around him acted in ways that confirmed this belief, cementing his own inflated sense of self. The cult of personality ensured not just political loyalty, but emotional and spiritual subservience, placing the pharaoh at the very center of their subjects' universe. While the pharaoh's grand projects and relentless self-promotion left behind an incredible legacy of art and architecture, there was a real cost to this grandeur. The narcissistic drive to build bigger, conquer more, and ensure eternal glory often placed immense burdens on the ordinary people of Egypt and on the overall stability of the kingdom. The most obvious cost was the sheer amount of resources and labor diverted to the pharaoh's personal monuments. Imagine thousands of people, generation after generation, working tirelessly on pyramids, temples, and tombs. This labor force could have been used for other things, improving irrigation, building better homes, or developing new technologies that might have directly improved the lives of the general population. Instead, much of it was directed towards structures primarily designed to ensure the pharaoh's afterlife and earthly glory. The endless demand for materials also meant significant strain. Quarries were worked intensively, requiring vast logistical operations to transport heavy stones across great distances. Skilled craftsmen and artists were dedicated to royal projects, often for their entire careers, meaning their talents were not always available for wider societal benefit. Military campaigns, often launched to expand the pharaoh's empire and bring back loot and captives, also came at a high price. While successful campaigns brought prestige and wealth to the pharaoh, they also meant sending thousands of young men away to fight, often for years. Many did not return, leaving families without providers. The cost of maintaining a large army, equipping it, and supplying it during campaigns was also enormous, draining the state treasury. For the common farmer, these demands meant heavy taxation in the form of crops or labor. A poor harvest could lead to severe hardship, and yet the demands for royal projects and military expeditions rarely eased. There's evidence of strikes and unrest among workers, particularly later in Egyptian history, hinting at the frustrations and burdens placed upon them. The focus on the pharaoh's individual glory could also overshadow the needs of the wider society. While a strong pharaoh might bring stability, an overly self-focused one could neglect important areas like local administration, justice for the common person, or long-term economic planning. Decisions might be made based on what enhanced the pharaoh's image, rather than what was truly best for the long-term well-being of the entire nation. Furthermore, the constant need to suppress rivalries or erase past pharaohs, as seen with Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, could create instability and divert energy that might have been better spent on governance. These power struggles, driven by a desire for singular glory, could be disruptive and wasteful. In essence, the pharaoh's relentless pursuit of self-aggrandizement, while creating an astounding archaeological record, often came at the expense of the average Egyptian. Their narcissistic drive to build an eternal monument to themselves, to conquer in their own name and to control history, required enormous sacrifices from the people they ruled, highlighting the often dark side of absolute self-centered power. The enduring legacy of pharaonic narcissism is therefore a complex tapestry of breathtaking achievement interwoven with the silent, often invisible, burdens placed upon an entire civilization. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt, with their grand visions and insatiable need for admiration, left behind a legacy that continues to fascinate and awe us thousands of years later. Their colossal monuments, intricate tombs, and elaborate narratives are not just relics of a lost civilization. They are enduring testaments to a leadership style deeply rooted in what we now understand as narcissistic tendencies. From around 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, generation after generation of pharaohs operated within a system that not only permitted but encouraged extreme self-exaltation. They were gods on earth, and their every action was designed to reinforce this belief. We've seen how this manifested in their obsession with building projects that literally reshaped the landscape, carving their names and images into eternity. Ramesses II, with his colossal statues and rewritten battle histories, stands as a prime example of this outward, boastful grandiosity. We've explored how they manipulated history, erasing rivals like Hatshepsut or radically changing religion to center on their own unique divine connection, as Akhenaten did. These actions were driven by a profound need for singular recognition, a desire to be the sole star in the cosmos of their kingdom. The cultivation of a powerful cult of personality, where absolute loyalty and unquestioning adoration were demanded, further solidified their inflated sense of self. Everyone around them was expected to reinforce their divine status, creating an echo chamber of self-importance that few could ever break free from. Yet, this incredible display of power and ego came with significant costs. The endless building projects and military campaigns drained the kingdom's resources and placed immense burdens on the ordinary people, whose lives were often sacrificed for the pharaoh's eternal glory. The scale of their self-obsession was truly staggering, but it's also important to remember the context. This wasn't just individual ego run wild. It was a deeply ingrained cultural and religious system that had evolved over millennia. The belief that the pharaoh was divine, the indispensable link between humanity and the gods, was fundamental to ancient Egyptian society. It provided order, meaning, and a sense of continuity. However, within this system, certain pharaohs pushed the boundaries of self-importance to extraordinary lengths, leaving an indelible mark that we can still see today. Their legacy is a complex one. On one hand, it's a testament to human ambition, organizational skill, and artistic brilliance. On the other hand, it's a stark reminder of the dangers of absolute power, unchecked ego, and the potential for a leader's self-obsession to overshadow the needs and well-being of an entire nation. The pharaohs, in their relentless pursuit of eternal glory, built a civilization that was both magnificent and deeply self-centered. Their story serves as a powerful historical lesson, showing us how the interplay of power, belief, and individual personality can shape the destiny of millions, leaving behind a legacy that continues to echo through the corridors of time.